Waging Peace, Chapter 6, Taking a Stand, Life as a Conscientious Objector. My experiences in Berlin and in the Soviet Union underlined the commitment I had made several years earlier that participating in war and killing people was not only tragic for the future of humanity, but against everything I believed. In the months leading up to my 18th birthday, I had been embroiled in intense soul searching. The decision with which I grappled was whether I should register with the Selective Service and apply to do alternative service, or refuse to register and go to prison. Behind this was the question, how can I most effectively say to my government that the military system that forces young men to kill others is wrong? I saw the answer as a decision I was making not just for the required 2-year stint, but for the rest of my life. I considered mass slaughter an absurd, immoral, and tragic way of trying to solve problems. I wanted to devote my life to experimenting with the power of nonviolence and helping to end militarism and injustice in the world. I talked with some of my dad's friends who had been imprisoned for refusing to fight in World War II and the Korean War. My heart was settling on refusing to register, to make it clear that I wouldn't kill and also that I wouldn't cooperate with a system that forced others to do so. But my mother didn't like the idea of her son spending years in prison. I finally decided to register as a conscientious objector. I had to at least entertain the possibility that this had to do with cowardice, but I don't really believe that it did. I remembered Bayard Rustin, a CO who had served time in prison during the Second World War and then became a leader in the civil rights movement, saying that being a pacifist is 1/10 conscientious objection and 9/10 working to do away with the things that make for war. I felt that for 2 years I could do something positive to help take away the causes of war and then continue that commitment for the rest of my life. So on May 10th, 1958, I wrote this letter to the Selective Service Board in Media, Pennsylvania. I am registering as a conscientious objector because I do not feel that it is right to take any human life. God has given life, and we don't have the right to decide that other human beings, like ourselves, no longer have a right to live. I believe that our whole draft system, which forces young men to kill others, is immoral and wrong. The only reason that I have registered at all is that I have a very strong affection and concern for our country and its democracy. And I hope that through love and kindness, I can appeal to the good in our government to abolish this law, which forces young men to kill other human beings. I hope that in my alternative service, I can do those things which will truly help create an atmosphere of peace in the world. I believe that those things which do help toward peace can only be done in a spirit of love and kindness toward all people. How can we expect to gain peace by war? We cannot reap flat figs from thorns or grapes from thistles. The ends do not justify the means. We cannot use evil means to achieve good ends. Force subdues, but love gains. We cannot get peace through war. In our effort to stop communism by force, we are tending more and more to use the means of the very enemy which we are fighting against. In our military forces, the individual conscience no longer has any say as to what should be done or what is right. Each man is forced to kill mass numbers of men, and now also innocent women and children, thinking of them not as human beings, but as targets which must be shot and killed. In the army, a man must obey the order of the man above him, or he is liable to the severest of punishments. This is a country of democracy. Why are we resorting to these dictatorial means to protect it? I have chosen the conscientious objector position because I want to give the most of myself that I can for the furthering of peace and goodwill among humankind. I am refusing to go into the army, not because I don't want to be killed, but because I cannot kill another person. I am choosing the alternative service position rather than the non-registrant position because I want to make my protest in as positive and loving a way as possible. I hope and pray that our government will realize and take into consideration that I, one US citizen, feel that this law is wrong, and I'm willing to spend my whole life in trying to win friends by love instead of hate, killing, and the H-bomb. When I showed up for my sophomore year at Howard University, I discovered that because it was a land grant school that received federal money, ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps, was compulsory for all male students. Just the sight of all those young men marching around campus in uniform made me feel ill. I found it particularly tragic that when the civil rights sit-ins started, most of the male students, after several months in ROTC, refused to participate in the demonstrations because of what they were learning in ROTC: allegiance to country, obedience to orders and all laws, and avoidance of all un-American activities. Initially, I was told by university officials that I had to join ROTC or leave Howard. Both the president and the vice president of the university were friends of Gandhi, and my dad introduced me to them. Vice President William Stewart Nelson, who taught the first class I took on nonviolence, offered a solution. He said that if I received recognition as a CO by my draft board within 10 days, I could stay at Howard without participating in ROTC. Mike Ingerman, a friend in Washington who was doing alternative service at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, helped me file the extensive papers with many, many questions to answer before the deadline. In my responses, I elaborated on my letter to the Selective Service Board. I believe that there is that of God in every person, regardless of race, creed, or nationality. Therefore, killing or even hating any person is injuring part of God himself. Just as I could not kill my brother, neither can I kill another human being who is also my brother on the other side of the world. Both are human beings created by God and given life by God. Who can give us the right to put an end to this wonderful creation of God, human life? Who can give us the right to cause suffering to the family of the man or men we kill? Noting the dangerous era we had entered with the advent of nuclear weapons, I made the point that not just individuals or nations, but the entire human race was endangered by war. I felt that we needed to uphold the humanity of all people and get past thinking of others as targets, as communists or capitalists, as enemies. I stated my belief that if we put 1/10 of the effort we spent on learning to kill others into trying to build understanding between nations, peace could be reached. I must follow this conviction and try to live it, I wrote, even though at present my government does not agree with me. I continued. I believe in the power of love as the strongest force in the world. It is the ability to accept suffering rather than inflict suffering that can win over the world. Hatred breeds hatred, while love and understanding try to bring friendship and conciliation with the so-called enemy. We call ourselves a Christian nation. Our coins state, "In God we trust." What has happened to our age-old teachings of "Thou shalt not kill"? Love your enemies, do good unto them that hate you. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I must ask myself the question, to whom do I owe my highest loyalty? Do I owe it to my school or to my local community or to my country, and in the meantime ignore all the other people in the world? I feel that I owe my allegiance to the whole human race and to God. However, I feel that while my highest loyalty is to God and to the whole human race, it is at the same time the greatest loyalty I can give to my country. Fortunately, the draft board in Media, Pennsylvania recognized me as a conscientious objector within the 10-day limit, and I was allowed to stay at Howard. During my time there, I worked evenings and weekends in the university library to make a little money. Working for the school required signing an oath of loyalty to the United States. I had pangs of conscience about whether or not to sign it. I ended up writing in, I would defend my country nonviolently, which was apparently good enough. I remembered that during one of the Quaker seminars I had attended as a high school student, a woman took a dollar bill, held it up, and began cutting it into pieces with scissors. She told us that it represented the federal budget. Over half of it was in one piece, and that represented the amount of money that went for the military and wars. She held up tiny pieces that stood for the amount spent on education, healthcare, and all foreign aid. I was moved that she cared so much about this issue, she was willing to destroy a dollar bill to help us students realize where our tax dollars really go. I recalled the leaders of the Philadelphia work camps who had been early role models for me, and I decided while I was at Howard to live on $600 a year to keep my earnings below the federal taxable level and avoid paying taxes for war, as they had done. This was one more thing that set me apart from the other students. I'm sure they thought I was quite strange. I survived by buying 30 cents worth of 3 different vegetables in the college cafeteria for lunch and dinner every day, supplemented with peanut butter sandwiches. I kept a stash of peanut butter, bread, and apples from home in my room for breakfast. I had become, by default, a vegetarian. I was particularly grateful for my friend Jim Lancaster, whom I had first met at a vigil against germ warfare at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He lived at home while attending Howard. Once a week, I bicycled there for a great home-cooked meal that he prepared for me. During my first year at Howard, my friend Bill Martin and I launched a project out of the Florida Avenue Friends Meeting House. We acquired the names and addresses of all the high school students in the Washington area. Then we wrote a letter making a case that they had a choice about whether or not to go to war as soldiers, and mimeographed thousands of copies of it. It took us many weeks, but we had hand-addressed 22,000 envelopes and sent out the letters with information about conscientious objection and a copy of my letter to the draft board. When news about the mailing appeared in the Washington Post the next day, Bill, who supervised all the pages serving Republicans in the US Senate, was fired from his job. A few weeks before my graduation from Howard, on May 1st, 1962, Ed Snyder, executive secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, invited me to join a delegation of 6 Quakers to meet with President John Kennedy in the White House. I was the token young guy. Our primary message was a plea for Kennedy to unilaterally stop nuclear bomb tests and work much harder toward peace with the Soviets. I suggested that he might challenge them to a peace race rather than continuing the escalating arms race. We also expressed our concern about a new nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that was going to be christened the William Penn. We pointed out the irony and affront of naming a battleship after a Quaker who had refused to take up arms and had established Pennsylvania as an American sanctuary for freedom of conscience. Kennedy chuckled and told us he would make sure that didn't happen. At that time, the people of China were suffering under a severe famine. The US government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars each year storing excess food in silos in Kansas. We appealed to the president to take some of that food that the taxpayers were paying to store and give it to the Chinese. You mean we should feed the enemy? He asked us. We said, yeah, that's what we mean. The president had just finished reading The Guns of August, a military history that describes in great detail the events leading up to the First World War. President Kennedy found scary the similarities between what was happening in 1914, when the world's nations were arming to the teeth to avoid war, and what was happening in 1962. We didn't know then that his words were an ominous foreshadowing of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we would face less than 6 months later in mid-October. Before that year ended, the world would come the closest it ever has to a full-scale nuclear war. Our delegation was a group of very ordinary folks. We were all impressed that the President of the United States sat in his rocking chair in the Oval Office talking with us for 40 minutes. We felt that he really listened and treated us as friends who had some truth he needed to hear. When his secretary came in to tell him that his next appointment had arrived, he said, "Tell him to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers." When we encouraged Kennedy to take more leadership in moving us away from the potentiality of nuclear confrontation with the Soviets to a more peaceful coexistence, he responded, in essence, "If you're serious about this, you're going to have to get out there and build a much more powerful movement to enable me to do that. The military-industrial complex is very strong," unquote. He had his marching orders, and so did we. A month and a half later, I was back at the president's house, but on the other side of the fence. Quaker peace activists Larry Scott and Wilmer Young, who had helped to organize the sailing of the Golden Rule into Pacific nuclear test waters when I was in high school, were holding a silent prayer vigil in front of the White House. Calling for an end to nuclear weapons testing, they had decided to vigil and fast for 40 days. A friend and I rode our bicycles from Howard almost every day to give them moral support. On the 27th day of their fast, a third person joined them. A federal ordinance made it illegal to assemble in front of the White House, and apparently 3 is a crowd. So the police arrested them and put them in jail. They were charged with being a public nuisance. A fellow named Cecil Thomas and I decided to continue their vigil in front of the White House. We held a sign like the one I would hold in Red Square in Moscow a few months later, which read, "Bomb tests kill people." After a few days, Helen Corson, a 92-year-old Quaker woman, joined us. And so we too were arrested for illegal assembly and being a nuisance. Opposing wars and militarism is indeed a nuisance for the military-industrial complex. Helen was an amazing woman. In court, the judge scolded her. "You shouldn't be here. You're too old to do this kind of stuff." The essence of her response was, "Judge, I don't know how I look, but if I don't have much longer to live, I want to make sure I spend what little time I've got making sure the world is still here for my children and grandchildren." It was a very touching moment. We were arrested on a Friday afternoon, and Friday night was a bad time to be in lockup. Dinner was a piece of bologna on moldy white bread. Men who had imbibed a bit too much were being thrown in with Cecil and me throughout the night. Eventually, 16 of us were crowded into a cell designed for 2 people. Cecil and I alternated, one of us sitting on the steel bench, the other lying down on the concrete floor with the cockroaches all night long. At one point, he rolled over and said, "Dave, there must be a better way to work for peace." I was allowed my one phone call, which I used to contact Vice President William Stewart Nelson at Howard. I alerted him that I might not make it to commencement the next day because I was in jail. I said, "Please tell everyone I'm sorry I can't be there." He said he would be sure to pick up my diploma and make an announcement about where I was and why. Unexpectedly, I was released at noon the following day. I rushed back to Howard to get my cap and gown just in time to walk across the stage and receive the diploma myself. After graduating from Howard, I was faced with a multitude of possibilities for alternative service. I could have taught English in Poland. I could have worked on community development in India or Mexico, or one of a few nations in Africa. I could have volunteered to be a guinea pig in the search for a cure for diseases. I weighed all the options. Ultimately, I decided to stay in Washington, D.C. and work with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. This Quaker lobbying organization tried to influence policies related to war, hunger, and poverty that affected millions of people around the world. I worked as the college secretary, getting paid at my request $50 a month so that I could continue to keep my earnings below the level at which I would have to pay federal taxes to fund war and nuclear weapons. I lived for the first year at the Peace Action Center, a cooperative household founded by Larry Scott, which accepted whatever I could afford to pay, which, given my salary, wasn't much. It was a wonderful place, hosting peace people from all over the world. My second year with FCNL, the Friends Committee for National Legislation, I lived in the basement of Friends in a tiny room with a hot plate where I heated the pea soup I ate pretty much every night, paying $10 a month in rent and providing some childcare for their young children. FCNL certainly got its money's worth. I spoke all over the country on college campuses and in churches, trying to raise interest in what was going on in the world and FCNL's work to change it. A few weeks after I started, I was driving home on October 22nd, 1962, from a speaking event in North Carolina with Ed Snyder, my mentor, who had a very humane way about him that he tried to bring to bear on international relations. We were in my VW Bug, listening to the big clunky radio that I had taken out of my brother's old Hudson when he junked the car and that I had jerry-rigged into the glove compartment of mine. We were coming up the Blue Ridge Parkway, straining to hear President Kennedy's ultimatum that if the Soviet ships loaded with missiles heading toward Cuba's missile silos didn't turn around, he would unleash nuclear missiles on Moscow. Washington, D.C. felt like the scariest place to be living in the country at that time. I could literally see the fear and feeling that this day may be our last on people's faces every day the following week as I rode my bike the 5 miles between home and the FCNL office on Capitol Hill every day. I was deeply relieved when Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev blinked and the crisis passed. And I was heartened the following summer when Kennedy gave an address at American University. He publicly challenged the Soviets to a peace race, just as our Quaker delegation had asked him to do a year before. He also proposed a ban on nuclear testing. Within 5 months, Kennedy was killed, another victim of an assassin's bullet. I felt like I had lost a friend, seeing the hope for change draining away once again. Another crisis followed a year and a half later. During the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, my job included calling the Pentagon to try to substantiate the Johnson administration's charge that the North Vietnamese Navy had launched torpedo attacks on our ships in the Tonkin Gulf. History has shown that the administration's accusation was unfounded, but the lie became the justification for the congressional Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave President Lyndon Johnson the authority to intervene militarily in any Southeast Asian country that was vulnerable to communist aggression. It opened the way for an escalation in the deployment of US forces in Vietnam and essentially launched the full-scale war there. Before the congressional vote took place, I made numerous calls to the Pentagon over several days and was always referred to someone else, getting no real answers. Finally, I was handed off to a general who apparently thought he had put me on hold. I overheard him say to a fellow officer, "This guy Hartsough has made close to 100 calls to the Pentagon over the last several days, and his questions are of more than just passing interest. If I had anything to say about it, I'd draft him and send him over to Nam." Fortunately, I had only 2 weeks left before completing my alternative service and was not shipped off to Vietnam. But after my time at FCNL, the federal authorities decided not to allow conscientious objectors to do alternative service there anymore. It was not in the Pentagon's best interests to have COs working against their wars and exposing their lies to Congress and the American people. If I had been successful in getting truthful answers to my questions to the Pentagon that August, I am confident Congress would not have voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and 2 million lives would not have been lost in that war, and hundreds of billions of dollars could have been available for a real war on poverty in the United States, That fall, I decided to enter graduate school in international relations at Columbia University in New York City. I was accepted into the prestigious International Fellows Program, which I thought would deepen my cross-cultural understanding and offer new insights in how to resolve differences among nations peacefully and end the Cold War. But international relations there was with the Cold War mindset and the need to continue developing massive military might, threatening the use of nuclear weapons, conducting covert CIA operations around the globe, and getting the upper hand to win the Cold War and maintain US control of the world. Most of the other students were headed toward high-powered government jobs with the State Department or the CIA. They wrote papers on how to win the Cold War, which Columbia regularly published. I wrote papers on improving relations with Cuba and ending the war in Vietnam. Neither of these got published, except by the American Friends Service Committee. Needless to say, I found the mentality at the university and my fellow students rather depressing. I felt quite lonely and unappreciated for challenging their way of thinking. None of them joined me when I went to the first draft card burning in Greenwich Village, which was a powerful moment for me. I was still living very simply. Entertainment for me consisted of spending 15 cents to ride the Staten Island ferry. And I went to one movie that year because it cost $1. The theater was so crowded that the only space available was sitting in the aisle. I thought the sound of music was profoundly beautiful, and for many nights, I drifted off to sleep, singing its songs. We students had an appointment one afternoon with Vice President Hubert Humphrey in the White House. When we arrived, a staff person told us, "The Vice President is in a very important meeting and will be here as soon as he can." He was meeting in the room next to us with President Johnson and his full cabinet. Humphrey showed up about 2 hours late. He greeted us. "Hello, boys. We've just made a momentous decision. I'm not at liberty to share what it is, but by this evening, you'll know." That night, the president announced that US armed forces were invading the Dominican Republic. Humphrey asked us if we had any questions. Not yet aware that we were about to invade the Dominican Republic, I asked about what most concerned me. I mentioned that we were getting more deeply involved in the war in Vietnam, that lots of people were being killed, both Vietnamese and American. I asked him why the United States had refused to allow free elections to take place in Vietnam in 1956, as was called for in the Geneva Accords, which likely would have prevented the horrendous war there. Humphrey went into a harangue for an hour and a half about how we can't trust the communists and they'll take over the world if we give them an inch. I guess he did answer my question. You can't support elections if people are going to vote for communists. At the end of his answer, he announced, "I have another meeting to go to." My question was the only one that got asked that afternoon. On November 9th, 1965, the biggest power failure in US history took out all of New York City and portions of 7 states, plunging us all into darkness. During the Great Northeast Blackout, in the class with Zbigniew Brzezinski, my fellow students flicked their cigarette lighters as we took lecture notes in the dark. I was very discouraged and sick of academia, feeling that they were in the dark, both literally and metaphorically. I turned in my thesis comparing attitudes toward wars of liberation in the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, and received my master's degree in January. In February 1966, I hitchhiked out of New York holding a sign that read, "Frisco or freeze." When I finally got to California, looking forward to a break and a visit with my brother, I found a message from Ed Snyder asking me to call FCNL's DC office any time of day or night. He made a job offer I couldn't turn down. I returned to the Friends Committee on National Legislation later in February to direct a 3-month emergency campaign to end the Vietnam War. I stayed for 5 years. I worked as a lobbyist to end the war and change the government's priorities, urging the redirection of the billions of dollars going into the war effort toward programs to alleviate the massive hunger and poverty in the United States and around the globe. I was growing increasingly uncomfortable with carrying a draft card in my wallet. That year, I finally sent it back to the Selective Service Board with a letter explaining to the authorities why I could not cooperate with the war system in any way. Though they could have imprisoned me for that action, they didn't pursue me, and I was grateful. When I arrived back in Washington, the Friends Committee on National Legislation was the only church-based lobbying group in town, and only 2 members of Congress had voted against supporting the Vietnam War. We organized Wednesdays in Washington, hosting people from all over the country, briefing them to visit with their members of Congress and urge a cutoff of funding for the war. Barry Commoner, who had run for president in 1980 on the Citizens Party ticket, brought a group every month from Washington University in St. Louis. We also organized lunch meetings at William Penn House on Capitol Hill, inviting 20 to 25 staffers of members of Congress to hear reports from people just returned from Vietnam. I accompanied around the Hill former peace and development workers who had served in Vietnam, trying to help members of Congress see the truth about the war, in contrast to all the propaganda they were receiving from the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and the news media. I'm grateful for people such as Don Luce and Jean Stoltzfus, who were concerned about being used by the US government as the war escalated and left international voluntary service in Vietnam to spend their time talking with members of Congress and the American people. And for David Schonbrun, a war correspondent who had been fired from CBS because of his open truth-telling about the war, who met with 25 members of Congress in a very powerful session in the Capitol building that I organized. One of the legislators who was most receptive to their stories and perspective was Ted Kennedy. He always had an open door policy toward FCNL. He was genuinely interested in what we were doing and the reports we had from on the ground in Vietnam. Getting meetings with his brother Robert Kennedy was more difficult, but I succeeded a few times. Both he and later Senator Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern asked my opinion about whether they should run for president. I encouraged them all. They were responsive to my reports about the quagmire in Vietnam and were strong anti-war candidates. I later joined the staff of the McGovern for President campaign in 1972 after I moved to Philadelphia. I happened to be riding to the ground floor in an elevator in the Senate office building with Robert Kennedy the day he declared that he would not run against Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination for president. As I walked with him to his car, I really wanted to say to him that he should read his brother John's book, Profiles in Courage. As it turned out, Johnson declined to run again, and Kennedy stepped into the race, which tragically ended with his assassination in June 1968. It was another huge loss in the effort to transform the country, and another deeply personal grief for me. The Friends Committee on National Legislation worked closely with the Vietnam Moratorium, which was a sustained and very powerful nationwide movement against the war. At noon on October 15th, 1969, all across the United States, in houses of worship, workplaces, and communities, people rang church bells, participated in vigils, and stopped work to indicate that they were fed up with the war and to demand that it end. Each month, we added another day, 2 days of resistance in November, 3 in December, and so on. I also worked closely with CALC, Clergy and Laity Concerned, thankful for that group's commitment to the struggle to end the war. CALC organized 500 constituents to come to Washington from all over the country to lobby, and I felt honored to offer the briefing for members of the clergy before they went to visit their members of Congress. I helped to organize a talkathon on the floor of the US House of Representatives, which went on for 14 hours, during which many members of Congress spoke out powerfully about the need to end the war. With a Quaker Action Group, AQAG, I also took part in a silent worship service in the gallery of the US Senate, while the legislators below us debated and voted for more funding for the war. When the vote was over, we were arrested on a charge of praying without a permit, which I found particularly fascinating. Later, we had a very moving public reading on the steps of the Capitol of all the names of those who had been killed in the war. We began doing the reading at the Capitol every Wednesday at noon. We usually made it through only the first 50 to 100 names before the Capitol Police arrested us. A few weeks into it, on a Tuesday afternoon, I went to see George Brown, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from California. I explained what we were doing and asked if there was any way he could help. He leaned back in his swivel chair, took a puff on his cigar, and said, "Sure." He joined us the next day on the Capitol steps. And not only that, he wrote a letter to every member of Congress urging them to lend their support. The following Wednesday, he and 3 other members of Congress showed up. Because they had congressional immunity, they were not subject to arrest, so they continued reading the names of the war dead after the rest of us were hauled off to jail. They made it through all 40,000 of the names of US soldiers who had been killed up to that point. That made the news. It was a very beautiful and powerful action and was reported widely in the local and national press. Soon afterward, Life magazine devoted an entire issue to picturing every American who had died in the war with their birthday, hometown, branch of service, and date of death. Within weeks, people were reading the names of the war dead in front of federal buildings, courthouses, and post offices all over the country. We learned of at least 1,000 communities that participated. Later, I asked George Brown, who was running for the US Senate that year, whether he was worried that his action would hurt his chances for getting elected. His answer was, "Dave, I decided a long time ago that if I did only what I felt was politically safe, I wouldn't do very much." I wished for many more such courageous politicians. Soon after that, Stewart Meacham of American Friends Service Committee had an idea for a witness at the White House. Tens of thousands of us gathered one evening in Arlington Cemetery, each of us carrying a candle and wearing around our neck the name of an American or Vietnamese person who had been killed in the war. We made a long funeral procession by candlelight across the bridge over the Potomac, marching solemnly all night long. As we arrived in front of the White House, each of us in turn read out the name we carried. Someone with a large drum beat it for every name. The reading went on for more than 24 hours. It was a deeply moving witness, a reminder of the enormity of the loss of human life in the war on both sides. Another action related to the war was a Quaker project to send medical supplies through the Vietnamese Red Cross to North Vietnam and the parts of South Vietnam controlled by the National Liberation Front. First, we tried mailing them through the US Postal Service to Hanoi, but the Postmaster General deemed this aiding the enemy and issued a regulation making it illegal for post offices to accept packages addressed to the Red Cross in Hanoi. So we started mailing the supplies to the Canadian Friends Service Committee, which forwarded them to Vietnam. The Postmaster General caught on to this as well and issued a directive to post offices informing them that they could not accept anything for the Canadian Friends Service Committee either. We decided to make a public witness. We carried the medical supplies we'd collected to the central post office next to the Union Station, Washington's train terminal on Capitol Hill, and tried to mail them to the Red Cross in Hanoi. When they were refused, we readdressed them to the Canadian Friends Service Committee in Canada, and they were refused again. So we held a press conference on the spot asking, don't we have a right to send medical supplies to Canadian Quakers? Subsequently, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, in DC filed a lawsuit, David Hartsough et al. Versus the Postmaster General, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State et al., which lasted several years and was eventually dropped. We later launched an underground railroad for the medical supplies, carrying them to Philadelphia, then Buffalo, and then on to Canada. where the CFSC sent them on to Vietnam. We also raised funds to send the Phoenix, a 50-foot yacht loaded with $10,000 in medical supplies, to Haiphong, a very risky venture for the Quaker crew, as the United States was bombing the Vietnamese harbor at the time. Though bullets were flying through the air over the boat, they managed successfully to deliver the supplies. A subsequent effort was thwarted when the South Vietnamese government turned the Phoenix away. A huge anti-war demonstration took place at the White House in November 1969. President Nixon claimed to be watching a football game on TV, but he was actually paying close attention to what was going on beyond his front lawn and at smaller demonstrations all around the country. We learned later that Nixon delayed bombing North Vietnamese cities for a couple years and decided against using nuclear weapons because of his fear of a revolution in the streets of America. While Presidents Johnson and Nixon wanted the peace movement to believe that our actions had no impact on US policy, author Tom Wells arrived at a different conclusion. After interviewing many of the key players in the government and the peace movement, he wrote The War Within. The book concluded that nonviolent resistance to the war by the American people on college campuses, in the religious community, within the ranks of the military, and in towns and cities across the country had played a crucial role in ending the war. Certainly the determination of the Vietnamese people to rid themselves of outside domination was critical, but so was massive US protest and refusal to cooperate with the war effort by the American people. On the Hill, I worked most closely with Wes Michelson of Senator Mark Hatfield's staff and John Holam from Senator McGovern's office. The Friends Committee on National Legislation helped to write the Senate bill proposing a cutoff of funding for the war, which Hatfield and McGovern co-sponsored. I visited other senators to add co-sponsors and also members of the House of Representatives to encourage similar legislation there. Though getting it passed would take some years, that bill eventually played a key role in ending US involvement in the war. I also worked very closely with Senator William Fulbright, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His book, The Arrogance of Power, was life-changing for me and for many others. His insightful analysis feels even more profound now in this era of American empire. Toward the end of those exhausting 5 years as a lobbyist on the Hill, I arranged for 3 Maryknoll missionaries who had been kicked out of Guatemala, accused unjustly of supporting the guerrillas there, to come to Washington and speak to members of Congress about their experience. It was discouraging to realize that even then, our nation was sowing the seeds for its future wars in Central America. One of the last and most powerful actions in which I was involved in Washington, D.C. was the People's Lobby in the spring of 1971. Thousands of people came from all around the country and participated in demonstrations at the White House, the Capitol building, and at the Selective Service and Internal Revenue Service offices. More than 7,000 people were arrested for demonstrations of conscience against the war that week. About 1,000 of us were at the Selective Service headquarters. Many of us decided to stay all night and block the entrance in the morning so that the employees couldn't carry on the business as usual of drafting young men to go to war. Early in the morning, we bowed in prayer so the workers would have to walk on our backs to get to work. But the police cleared us away before the employees arrived and charged us with disturbing the peace. Ironic, since we were there trying to disturb the war. The court judge offered us a choice of paying a low fine, $50, or spending up to 3 months in jail. He strongly encouraged us to pay the fine. A few of us refused to pay, asserting our belief that we had done nothing wrong. The judge lectured us sternly, threatening to give us the maximum sentence. We persisted, and he finally declared 1 day in the county jail. We were very relieved. As it turned out, we had barely changed into our jail clothes when a prison guard came and told us to get ready to be released. Apparently, it wasn't legal to sentence someone to 1 day in jail. A minimum of 2 days was needed to process prisoners in and then process them back out. So we were set free after a couple of hours. I was learning that the powers that be would do virtually anything to scare people into submission, short of calling our mothers, as Mrs. Alexander had claimed to do. But over and over, I watched the grip of the system crumble when people refused to give in to their fears or grant the government power over them, withholding their cooperation from its unjust orders and demands. It's a lesson I would need to cling to tightly as I decided to escalate my opposition to the deadly and relentless war in Vietnam.